Everybody, welcome back. It's Unit 1, Topic 5. A little bit of the flip side of Unit 1, Topic 3 from a couple of times ago where we looked at the political dimension of sporting organization. And today we're going to look specifically at the sporting dimension of political organizations. And there's a wide range in which political entities turn to sports. And we'll look at this a lot during the course of the semester. Today is really just sort of laying out the framework for how it happened and some of the main considerations. Essentially, a political organization will turn to something that's useful to it. If it can help them accomplish its aims, then they're going to use it if they can, and if it makes sense to do so. And because sport is something in which so many people in a given country either participate in, or watch, care about, then it's not uncommon for the countries to use them, or the organizations. Because not all of them are countries, as you'll see here on this next slide. A lot of them are what's called intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs. So in 1.3, we looked at the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, things to which governments do not formally belong. And these are things to which governments do formally belong. So at the United Nations, it's a broad-based forum working on global issues that involves both a permanent secretariat, in other words, the group of people who work for the organization and stage meetings and then implement the decisions made by the members. And then the member states, who are representatives of the heads of state of their particular country. So that means that the person in the United States who is the ambassador to the United Nations represents formally the President of the United States in negotiations, carries that portfolio, that official representation that they have, as do all the rest of the ambassadors at the meetings. So it's broad-based, but they can be very specific in nature as well. So starting on the left here with NATO, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It has a very specific defense mandate, and so it was formed during the Cold War as a counterbalance to the Soviet bloc. It requires member states to defend others in their treaty organization if they're attacked, and it's highly relevant even today. We have in 2022 a couple of pending membership additions in Sweden and Finland who are concerned about Russian aggression still, and so they want to join the organization. The G20 is the group of the 20 largest economies, or 19 states plus the European Union as a collective, so the group of 20. And they talk about common trade and commerce and inflation and monetary policy and things like that could facilitate the global economy. So they get together for those purposes. The OIC is a different kind of IGO, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The states here in green, what their job is to do is not defense, not trade so much as promoting the stature and the rights of the Muslim community at home and abroad. And so they talk things like Palestinian rights. They look at ways to promote development in the Muslim world from a Muslim perspective. So there'll be a Muslim Development Bank. There is an organization on Muslim sport and things like this. So it can be really any sort of purpose that the states getting together want to form. So that's similar to an NGO, right? An NGO has the right to focus on whatever it wants to do, and then it admits members as it wishes. In this case, similar, but as it admits members, they are official representations of governments. And again, what works is what they might turn to. So in the IGO realm, there is a turn to sports. So United Nations and climate change, they're looking for anything that works. Can you raise the message? Can you have more, for example, awareness generated through sport or sporting activities than others? So the occurrence of a regatta, a sailing regatta, could be a very useful occasion to talk about ocean health and life below water. Sport 2030, this hashtag down here, is a look at the ways in which something called the Sustainable Development Goals. These are major initiatives by the global community, each represented by one of these colored tiles in the O, that the world's trying to achieve by 2030, that there are ways in which sport can be used to promote those. And so, if it's useful, they'll use it. UNICEF often turns to sport and play, and in fact declares that every child has a right to play. They turn to sport quite often. And for a long time, the FC Barcelona football team in Spain, they wore UNICEF logos on their jerseys to advertise the organization and try and get funding to go into UNICEF to help children's rights. WADA is a little bit different. It's kind of a hybrid because it's made up of representatives from three pillars. One pillar is the sporting community, the NGOs, the IFs, the bingos. One pillar is countries with their formal representation there. And the third pillar is the scientific community, where they're trying to keep doping out of sport. We'll look at WADA more in Unit 4, but again, whatever works, so they're going to turn to sport. And so specific programs and the way these play out are pretty broad. Let's start with the UN Women one. UN Women is an entity. They actually call themselves an entity within the UN structure that's designed to bring basically to gender norm things, to make it so that someday there don't have to be a UN Women because everything is normalized in the UN system with women. But they talk about in their sports promotion programs that you get a win in one field, and then you develop winning strategies for others. So it's a way in to channel success through beginning in sport and continuing outside of sport. The next picture on the bottom left is, if you look at the badge that these soccer players are wearing, it's the UN Development Program. They're the ones that oversee the Sustainable Development Goals, those tiles from the previous screen. And for a long time, they played something called the Match Against Poverty, a very high-profile, often retired footballers. These are a couple of famous players, a Brazilian named this is Ronaldo, and a Frenchman named Zinedine Zidane. Even the referee, the Italian Collina, a very famous individual. So they would have these matches raise a bunch of money. They're also concerned about who they're reaching, when, and how through the IGOs. And so there are a number of illiterate people around the world and youth that they want to engage. So this cartoon that came out of a group of different UN organizations, UNAIDS, which is one that promotes awareness of and treatment for HIV/AIDS, is there. And then some others as well. So there are specific kinds of programs. Now, what does this all mean? So we're about to look at countries now, not just IGOs, but how countries engage. And I hope that you circle back and ask some questions if it doesn't entirely make sense, because it might not entirely make sense the way it fits together. So we're going to start here on this slide briefly, which is a picture of the presidential cabinet from the COVID era, so they're distant. So really, it's not so much the picture you want to focus on, or that it's Biden. In this case, it's a U.S. president and who they have as their main advisors and counselors, and who they also have in their line of succession. So these are written out here in the line of succession for who would become president if the next person in line, or the next person ahead of them, is incapacitated or dead. So what you have is people who are in charge of important sectors of the economy or of the country. So you'll see that you go from the vice president to the secretary of state. They're in charge of our foreign affairs. The next is the treasury. That's our economy. Defense is our military. Justice is our entire system of prosecutors and judges and policing. Interior is basically our land and our land holdings, agriculture, etc., right? This is a pretty important group of people. Now, we do not, but I wanted to start with this picture. We do not, but many countries have a minister of sport who is in that realm, who both sits in council at the table with the president and who is in line of succession. Now, not all of them are uniquely the minister of sport. So Annika Wells of Australia, she's the minister of sport. She also is, I think, minister for aging, but they're different portfolios. So what I mean by that is she's the minister of sport and she's the minister of aging, but the next person could be one or the other and not necessarily both. But in other countries, the ministry has multiple perspectives. So in many places, it's just the minister of sport, and others it's something different. So these other 4 examples down here are the ones that I want to point to as ways in which they conceptualize different things. So these aren't just small countries, right? You think, okay, if the U.S. doesn't do it, what kind of country does? Well, in this case, you would see that that some sizable countries, some countries that we would look at, some as peers and others as second-tier states, have a minister for sport. So they're sitting there and talking about sport at the highest level. So it doesn't mean that they're in charge of the bingos or the federations, but they're coordinating with them and talking about national strategies. Okay, so remember, a sporting federation is an NGO. So if you go back to that conversation forum, we'll go forward to it again here in a couple of lectures, is you've got the concept that they operate outside control of the government. So they're allowed to coordinate and set up plans, but when the federation does implementation of those plans, they have to do so free of control of the government. And so sometimes that takes the form of actually rejecting money or rejecting influence. So this is an example from about 10 years ago that's still active, where to avoid appearances of interference or influence, they don't want to listen to them, that the Indian Olympic Association, that National Olympic Committee, the NOC in India, said to the government, we don't want any more of your money. We're going to be autonomous. So that's one approach, and it's a pretty strong one, because there's other examples that are pretty much on the opposite end of the system. So that would be Australia, as I mentioned. So there's Annika Wells. She oversees many of these things, but has a large staff. So there is, under the Australian government, there's a sports commission that coordinates things. They have had what's called the Winning Edge program, and we'll look at the new one that they have now. And they have the Australian Institute for Sport. So they're studying things. There's science, there's promotion, there's training of coaches and administrators, there's identification of athletes, and there's a concerted goal on the part of the country to get things done. So these are the goals that they had between 2012 and 2022, so this decade, where they were trying to accomplish these aims and doing concerted work at it. And if I flip back to this slide, this is her quote. We know that sport will help achieve many objectives of the Australian government. And so the objectives are development-oriented, are economics, are stature of Australia around the world. So, like, what do we think of Australia? When we think of Australia, what do we picture? And the idea is that through sporting achievement, we will think of them more positively and be more likely to travel there, invest money there, support our politicians when they want to make deals there, that we will feel about Australia the way Australia wants us to feel about them. So this has shifted now into a new program called the Green and Gold Decade, and the Green and Gold Decade is really focused on hosting major events and getting more people into Australia. So it started with this framework here of the Cricket World Cup going through the Summer Olympic Games of 2032 and all the things that will happen in between. So the 2023 Women's World Cup, a Netball World Cup, a Rugby World Cup, they keep getting added to. They're focused on bringing people to Australia and showing what they can do. And this is a government program, not just a sporting program, but the sporting federations are the ones who are in charge, right? So Australia will say, Netball Australia, what do you need? And then Netball Australia will go and do what they need. But it won't be the government telling Netball what to do, if that makes sense. Go ahead and Google Netball. That's a fun one. So let's bring it back. And how, to this slide we had a couple of times ago, where you can suspend federations. So I will try to lay out a case that in many countries, if not most countries, there is government interest in how sports do. And we'll look at more examples later. And so sometimes they want to get involved, right? They want to get involved in the management of the federations. So Nigeria was suspended by FIFA. It was suspended by FIFA because the government was trying to clean up corruption in the federation. They didn't want corruption because they didn't want the federation to suffer. They wanted the team, the Super Eagles, to play well. But that's third-party interference, and FIFA cracked down. And there were howls of protest from across Nigeria. I have Nigerian friends. I used to hang out with a couple of players who had played for the Nigerian national team. It matters there. In Portugal, some of the clubs weren't adopting the statutes that FIFA wanted them to adopt as sort of a whole thing about financial health. So they were threatened with suspension. Ronaldo's from an island that I used to live on, a Portuguese island called Madeira, and grew up in Funchal. Really cool place. I know how much people care about that. There was pressure leveled on the clubs to do. Togo's really different. Togo was on their way to a tournament and were attacked by terrorists. And when they were attacked, the president said, you should come home. And that constituted interference in the eyes of the African Football Federation. So they were suspended, and then that was reversed. So there could be legitimate reasons why these countries the governments want to get involved. So anyway, they're going to turn to sports because it works and people care.